A very warm welcome from my side as well, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight and lead through this evening. I will start with an introduction of Nancy Fraser, and I will keep it very short because I don't want to take off any time of her and her lecture, and I don't think she needs an extensive introduction because everybody, at least most of us, have read an interview or a paper or even one of her books. Nancy Fraser is a professor of politics and philosophy, at the New School, which is located in New York City. And she has been a visiting
Germany,
professor
in France,
at various universities,
and in the Netherlands, I think.
all over the place, but also all over Europe. And she has written extensively on feminist issues, especially on care work within the last few years. And I myself, I'm forever grateful for her work on justice and the notion of justice just being more as just one term, one issue, but the distinction between recognition justice or recognitional justice and distributive justice, which is for an economist myself very important because it tends to be the jurisdictional issue and term, but not the distributional term, and that's in a feminist environment, in a feminist economist environment, very important. But I'll keep it with that and just tell you that Nancy Fraser is going to talk about social reproduction today, about care work, and more specifically on or about the crisis of care and care crisis. And I'll give the floor to you, and I'm very, very honored to be here tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Katerina, for that very warm and generous introduction. And let me thank all the organizers and sponsors and promoters. It's a great pleasure to be here. And of course, I'm going to thank in advance Marian Puschmann for the terrific interpretation. Well, as you just heard, I'm here to talk about care and about the crisis of care. But I want to try to make the case that we cannot understand the crisis of care in a freestanding way as something unto itself, but instead need to understand it as one aspect of a much larger crisis, a general crisis of capitalist society that also includes other strands. And I'll explain that as I go. In any case, I probably don't need to tell this audience that when we speak of a crisis of care today, we are talking about the tremendous pressures that are coming at us from several different directions simultaneously. Pressures that are squeezing the time, the energy, and the social capacities that we have or should have available for producing and raising children, for caring for friends and families, for maintaining households and the broader communities and neighborhoods in which our households are situated. Also energies for sustaining social connections more broadly. Now, as you know, feminists call all of this activity the work of social reproduction. And historically, it has been understood as women's work, and indeed, it has chiefly been performed by women, although it's important to recognize that men have always contributed to social reproduction as well. Now, this labor, this social reproductive labor, has both affective or emotional aspects, and it has material aspects, and it has cultural aspects. Historically, again, it has often been performed without pay. And of course, it's fully essential, indispensable to society. If this work did not happen, this care work, the social reproductive labor, then there could not be any official economy, nor any political organization. Society would essentially collapse. No society that systematically undermines the possibility of care work can endure for long. And yet today, a new form of capitalist society is doing just that, undermining the energies available for care work. And the result is a major crisis of social reproduction, which I want to try to explain. However, first, let me tell you that as I understand it, this crisis of social reproduction or care, as I said before, is one strand of a larger crisis, which also contains other strands of crisis, strands of economic crisis, a very severe ecological crisis, and a political crisis. You could call that a crisis of democracy. All of these strands, including the social reproductive strand, intersect with one another and exacerbate one another. The care strand forms a very important, even central dimension of this broad crisis complex in which we find ourselves today, but it is too often neglected in current discussions, which focus chiefly on the economic, ecological, and political strands. And that's obviously a reflection of a certain kind of androcentrism or gender bias, as well as by the whole problem of academic specialization. Right, every discipline is latched onto its own strand and nobody looks at the whole. So as a result, a lot of our discussions of crisis have overlooked the crisis of care, and that has become the province of gender studies. And unfortunately, what that means in our world is that this discussion is somewhat ghettoized, marginalized. Many of us hoped that that would change in the wake of COVID, which did disclose, again, for a broader public, the vital importance of care work. We will see if that really does change things in an important way. The jury is still out. In any case, I want to echo the claims of many feminist scholars that the social reproductive strand is so central to our broader crisis complex that none of the other strands can be properly understood in abstraction from it. But I also want to insist on the converse. The crisis of social reproduction is not freestanding and cannot be grasped on its own. So if we feminists want others to include what is considered to be our subject, we are also going to have to include plenty of other subjects. Okay, how should the crisis of social reproduction be understood if it's not freestanding? I'm going to treat it as expressing the social reproductive, what I call the social reproductive crisis of capitalism. And when I use that phrase, I really am signaling 2 points. First, the present strains on care are not accidental, but have deep systemic roots in the structure of our social order. And second, they indicate something rotten, so to speak. I'm quoting Hamlet, something rotten, not only in capitalism's current financialized or neoliberal form, but in capitalist society per se, in all forms of capitalism. So let me begin with the second point, something rotten in capitalism per se. Every form of capitalist society, I think, harbors a deep-seated social reproductive crisis tendency or contradiction. And here it is in a nutshell. On the one hand, social reproduction is a condition of possibility for sustained capital accumulation. Without the care work that produces workers, for example, you don't have capital accumulation. But on the other hand, the system's drive to endless accumulation of capital tends to destabilize the very processes of social reproduction or care on which it depends. That's what I mean by the social reproductive contradiction of capitalism. And that contradiction, I think, lies at the root of our present crisis of care. It's a contradiction that is inherent in capitalism in general, in all forms of capitalism, but it assumes a different and distinctive guise in every historically specific form or phase of capitalist society. So it looks different, for example, in the liberal colonial capitalism of the 19th century, the famous industrial capitalism. It looked different too in the social democratic form of capitalism of the post-war era, post-World War II era. We could call that the state-managed monopoly capitalism of that time. And it looks different yet again today in the financialized neoliberal globalizing capitalism of the present. So the care deficits that we experience today are the form that this contradiction takes in that last, most recent phase of capitalist development, the neoliberal phase. Now, standard left-wing views of capitalist crisis, traditional Marxist views of capitalist crisis, focus on contradictions that are internal to the economy. At the heart of capitalism, they claim, lies a built-in tendency to self-destabilization, which expresses itself periodically in economic crises. This view is right, I think, as far as it goes, but it fails to provide a full picture of the system's inherent contradictions or crisis tendencies. It adopts what we could call an economistic perspective. It understands capitalism too narrowly, as if it's nothing more than an economic system. In contrast, I think we need an enlarged understanding of capitalism, which includes not just its official economy, but also the background conditions, the non-economic background conditions that make that economy possible. And of course, care work or social reproduction is one such important background condition of possibility. In my view, only this sort of an enlarged view permits us to understand and, of course, to criticize capitalism's full range of crisis tendencies, including those that are implicated in the present strains on care and on social reproduction. So my argument here is that capitalism's official economy depends on social reproductive activities external to it, which form one of its background conditions of possibility. There are others, including ecological conditions of possibility, political conditions of possibility, and so on, all of which are discussed in my most recent book, which is called Cannibal Capitalism. But here we're going to focus on the care part. The capitalist economy, I'm claiming, relies on, or perhaps we should say free rides on, activities of provisioning, caregiving, and social interaction that produce and maintain social bonds, even though it accords those activities no monetized value and treats them as if they were free, almost like free gifts of nature, which is parallel to the way the system does treat nature in many cases. These activities have sometimes called care, affective labor, or in some paradigms, Foucauldian paradigms, subjectivation. Whatever we call them, this activity forms capitalism's human subjects. It sustains them as natural beings, while also constituting them as social beings, forming their habitus and what we could call, following Hegel, the socio-ethical substance, the objective spirit in which these subjects move. So central, as I said earlier, is the work of socializing the young, maintaining households and household members, building communities, sustaining the shared meanings, affective dispositions, and horizons of value. that underpin social cooperation and without which social cooperation would break down. In capitalist societies, much, though not all of this activity goes on outside the market, in households, in neighborhoods, in communities, and in a host of public institutions, including schools and hospitals, at least in some systems they're public. And much of this activity, again, though not all, does not take the form of wage labor. Yet, social reproductive activity is vital to the existence of wage work, to the accumulation of surplus value, hence to the functioning of capital as such. Wage labor could not exist in the absence of housework, child raising, schooling, affective care, and many, many other activities which help to produce new generations of workers and to replenish existing workers, as well as, I said before, to maintain social bonds and shared understandings. Like nature, and like the public power with which states use to produce public goods, social reproduction is an indispensable background condition for the possibility of economic production in a capitalist society. From their very beginnings, however, capitalist societies have separated the work of social reproduction from that of economic production. They associate the first with women and the second with men. They have remunerated care in the coin of love and what they call productive work in the form of money wages. Now, that has created an institutional basis for new modern forms of women's subordination and gender asymmetry. Splitting off reproductive labor from the larger universe of human activities in which women's work previously held a recognized place, they relegated it to a separate private domestic sphere where its social importance was obscured and where it was not really viewed as work at all. And in this new world, where money is a primary medium of power, the fact that care work is largely unpaid seals the matter. Those who do this work are structurally subordinate to those who earn cash wages, even as their work supplies the necessary precondition for wage labor. So, in general, I'm arguing that capitalist societies separate social reproduction from economic production. They associate the first with women. They obscure its true importance and social value. Ironically, however, they make their official economies dependent on the very same processes of social reproduction that they devalue. This is a very peculiar and I would say perverse situation. It's a relation of separation plus dependence, and it's a built-in source of potential instability in the society. On the one hand, capitalist economic production is not self-sustaining, but relies on social reproduction. On the other hand, its orientation to endless accumulation is always threatening to destabilize the very reproductive processes, the very capacities for care that capital, and by the way, the rest of us need. The effect over time, as we'll see, can be to destabilize the necessary social reproductive conditions of the capitalist economy and thus of the society more broadly. So this is what I mean in a nutshell by the social reproductive contradiction, which is inherent in the deep structure of capitalist societies. And like the other contradictions discussed in my book, an ecological contradiction, a political contradiction, and so forth, as well as the well-understood economic contradictions, this one too grounds a crisis tendency. However, in this case, the contradiction is not located inside the official economy of the society, but rather, if you like, at the border that separates and also connects production and reproduction. The contradiction is not intra-economic, nor is it exactly intra-domestic, but it's a contradiction between those two constitutive realms or regions of the social order. I sometimes explain that by saying that this is a contradiction that has more to do not with the first Karl Marx, but with the second Karl Polanyi, for those who know his thought. Okay. Often, of course, this contradiction is muted, and the associated crisis tendency remains latent, under wraps, or at least marginal. It becomes acute, however, when capital's drive toward boundless accumulation becomes unmoored from its social reproductive bases and turns against them. In that case, the logic of economic production, which is that logic of endless accumulation, overrides that of social reproduction, which has a completely different structure and temporality. And the result is to destabilize those very social processes on which capital depends. What are compromised then are the social capacities, both domestic and public, both private and community, that are needed to sustain accumulation over the long term, and of course that are needed to sustain our lives. Destroying its own social conditions of possibility, then, in that case, capitalism's accumulation dynamic effectively eats its own tail, like the Ouroboros that is on the cover of my book, Cannibal Capitalism. That's exactly our situation today. The current financialized form of capitalism is systematically consuming our capacities to sustain social bonds. It has withdrawn a great deal of public support for social reproduction, which was provided in the previous social democratic era of capitalism. And it is doing that at exactly the moment where it is conscripting women, the chief providers of care work, increasingly into long and grueling hours of paid work, effectively depleting the very social capacities on which it, and of course we, depend. I'll be interested maybe in hearing from you in the discussion whether this is so far advanced in Austria, which I know has a much, has historically at least had a lower rate of female labor force participation than certainly the US and many other countries. But in our case, at least, we have the massive entry of women into wage work, some of which is certainly by choice, and other portions are by necessity because of the precarity and low wage, increasingly low wage character of our labor markets. Okay, so we have both defunding or at least decreasing of the funding for social provisions and a much greater pull and push of women into the labor market. Now that's a formula for depleting energies for care. It's like a pincers movement coming from both sides. To understand how we got to this point, I want to contrast the present form of capitalism with some previous forms. Now, it's a common idea that the history of capitalism consists in a succession of different regimes of accumulation or forms of capitalism. For example, mercantile capitalism, liberal colonial capitalism, state-managed or social democratic capitalism, and the present neoliberal financialized capitalism. Scholars usually distinguish between these regimes in terms of the distinctive ways in which states and markets are related to each other. But they have neglected the relation between production and reproduction, which is equally important for understanding these regimes. That relation, as I've said, is a defining feature of capitalist society and must have a place at the center of our analysis of it. We can go a long way toward understanding capitalism's history by focusing on how social reproduction is organized in each of its phases. For any given phase, how much of care work is commodified? How much is supported through state or corporate provision? How much is located in households, in neighborhoods, in civil society? These questions matter. On this basis, I want to try to trace an historical path from the liberal colonial capitalism of the 19th century to the state-managed or social democratic regime of the mid-20th century and on to the financialized capitalism of the present era. In a nutshell, liberal colonial capitalism domesticated social reproduction. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Social democratic capitalism partially socialized it. Financialized capitalism is increasingly commodifying. These are three very different ways of treating social reproduction. In each case, a specific organization of social reproduction goes along with a distinctive set of gender and family ideals. For the liberal capitalist regime, which domesticated social reproduction, the ideal was a kind of separate spheres for men and women, a Victorian social imaginary. For the social democratic regime, which partially socialized social reproduction, the ideal was the family wage. Male breadwinners of the working class should be paid enough to support an entire family on one wage. And if women worked, it was really going to be to supplement, but not to fundamentally contribute to the family wage. For the neoliberal regime, financialized regime of the present, the new ideal is what is called the two-earner family, which sounds very feminist, but as I'll explain, it's got a nasty underside to it. Okay, let's start with the liberal colonial regime. And that's my term really for 19th century capitalism. It's often called industrial capitalism, but that leaves out the colonial underside from which value was siphoned to the industrializing countries of Europe and North America. So I want to widen that lens to treat it as on a world system basis. In this era, the states of the capitalist core, meaning the wealthy countries of Europe and North America, mainly looked on from the sidelines as industrialists were, in a sense, dragooning newly proletarianized people who'd been dispossessed of their land, including women and children, into factories and mines. So here you have a whole bunch of dispossessed farmers and peasants crowding into the cities in search of work, and it's chaos. Everybody is desperately clawing to get these jobs in factories and mines. Now, that clearly and immediately resulted in a crisis of social reproduction, because the conditions, if you think about Friedrich Engels' book on the conditions of the working class in England, his description of Manchester, England, which is a leading and industrializing city, pollution, crowded tenements, the impossibility of healthy conditions and conditions where people had time to devote to family and children. So this prompted a public outcry, and in England and in many other countries, including, I believe, in Austria, it gave rise to campaigns for so-called protective legislation, which were aimed at limiting the hours and the kinds of work that women could be employed in, all in the name of protecting the family. But of course, those policies did not really solve the problem, because they didn't provide any replacement for the wages that women lost, or indeed even for the wages that children lost, which were essential to the household. They simply left poor and working class communities to fend for themselves, and drove many women into sex work, in fact, as a result. Now, at the same time, however, this form of capitalism was culturally inventive, recasting social reproduction as the sphere of women within the private family it invented this whole new bourgeois ideology of domesticity, this ideology of separate spheres, that the family was a haven and the heartless world, that the woman was the angel in the house. You probably are familiar with some of this imagery. It comes from Victorian England, but there are versions of it elsewhere in the German-speaking world too. And it disseminates this ideology at the same time that it is depriving most people, the overwhelming majority, of the conditions that the material conditions, social conditions, the economic conditions that they would need in order to actually realize those ideals. Now, this was especially true in the capitalist periphery, where, of course, you have a raging form of extractive colonialism that is ravaging subjugated populations. They have no possibility of separate spheres nor any social protection at all. Far from seeking to protect these local indigenous relations of social reproduction in the colonized territories, metropolitan powers are actively promoting the destruction of social reproduction there. They are looting peasant communities. They are instrumentalizing the reproductive capacities of enslaved women in all of the slave world of Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. So it wasn't long before this liberal colonial regime was unraveled and subject to a general crisis in which these social reproductive impasses I've been describing converged with other dysfunctions, ecological, political, and economic. I'm not going to go into the details of all that, you can imagine. In the 20th century, then, this regime I've been describing gives way to a new state-managed variant of capitalism. The new regime is based on mass industrial production and increasingly on mass consumption in the capitalist core, as people began to understand that you needed actually to have consumers to buy this massive output of mass production, and therefore you were going to need a different way of dealing with the working classes in the core. In this period, then, social reproduction was partially socialized through state and corporate provision of what we call social welfare. So the increasingly quaint idea of separate spheres, the Victorian ideal, gives way to a new, more modern form of the family wage. And this ideal had the very strong support of labor movements. According to the ideal, the working man should be paid enough to support his whole family, which would enable his wife to devote herself full-time or nearly full-time to her children and to the household. Again, only a relatively privileged minority of working class people actually achieved this ideal, but it was aspirational for many, many more, at least in the wealthy states of the capitalist core. Certainly in the colonies, and some of them were becoming independent, we can speak of the post-colony, certainly they were excluded from these arrangements, which rested on continuing predation of the global South. The wealthy, provision to soften the social contradiction in the capitalist core was financed largely by wealth that was siphoned from the periphery. And I would add, by wealth siphoned from nature, because it's the internal combustion engine that is the real power that behind the mass production in the age of the automobile. That is the age of social democracy. So, in other words, there were built-in asymmetries, colonial, post-colonial asymmetries, and also built-in racial asymmetries in some of the core states, especially the US, where domestic and agricultural workers, who are primarily workers of color, were officially excluded from Social Security and other forms of public provision at the start of the New Deal. And of course, as we know very well, this family wage regime institutionalized women's dependency and heteronormativity. So state-managed capitalism was no golden age, as it is sometimes described, even if it did provisionally diffuse the crisis of care, at least for some populations, for majority ethnicity, working class families of the global north. In time, however, the state-managed regime itself entered into a general crisis and gave way to the present financialized regime. This new regime, globalizing neoliberal, is and has promoted state and corporate disinvestment from social welfare, while, as I said before, recruiting women heavily into the paid workforce. So it is externalizing care work onto families and communities at the very same time that it is diminishing their capacity to perform it by requiring them to devote more and more hours to wage labor. So we have now a new organization of social reproduction. I would call it a dualized organization. Social reproduction is commodified for those who can pay for it, whose jobs permit them to hire people to do their care work for them. And it is privatized for those who cannot afford that, some of whom actually are providing care work for the first group in return for very low wages with very weak, if any, labor rights. So, meanwhile, the 1-2 punch, I would call it, of feminist critique of social democracies, right, institutionalization of women's dependency on the one side, and deindustrialization and offshoring on the other side. That's a 1-2 punch that stripped the family wage of all credibility and paved the way for this new modern norm of the so-called two-earner family. A major driver of these developments and a defining feature of this regime is the new centrality of debt. Debt is the instrument by which global financial institutions pressure states to slash social spending, to enforce austerity, and to generally collude with investors in extracting value from working populations who are increasingly defenseless against this. In the global south, of course, debt fuels peasant dispossession, a massive wealth drain in the form of interest payments to international lenders, mandatory IMF, International Monetary Fund, imposed austerity, and the creation of so-called global care chains through the export of women workers to perform care work in the global north in exchange for remittances, wages sent back to their families in the global south. That's how it looks from the southern side. Now, from the historic core, the perspective of the northern side, low-wage precarious service work is increasingly replacing unionized industrial labor, causing wages to fall below the socially necessary costs of reproduction, and therefore requiring working-class families to take on enormous levels of consumer debt, right? Automobile loans, mortgages, credit card debt, student debt, payday loans, and so on and so forth. Well, what I'm suggesting then is that it is increasingly through debt that capital is now cannibalizing labor, disciplining states, transferring wealth from periphery to core, and sucking value from households, families, communities, and indeed from nature. All of this means that we see an intensification of the inherent contradiction between economic production and social reproduction. And that makes a mockery of the new ideal of the two-earner family. When that ideal sounds like it's gender egalitarian, but it is also at the same time mystifying the steep rise in the number of hours of paid work that are now required to support a household. Just as I said, when public services are being cut in the name of austerity. So between increased working hours per household, decreased public provision, the regime is stretching our caring capacities to the breaking point. If we need proof that that's going on, I would cite again the proliferation of global care chains, which institutes a care drain from the global south to the global north. I would also cite, these may sound exotic to you, but they're important in the United States, the proliferation of egg freezing among privileged women of the global north who work for firms like Google, which urge them to delay their childbearing and devote their most productive years, which also happen to be their reproductive years, to cognitive capital. Also, in the US at least, the skyrocketing popularity of mechanical breast pumps, especially 2-cup no hands models, which let you express milk while driving to work on the freeway. And you can then the milk can be, used later, fed to your child by your nanny later. And finally, all those scenes from the COVID lockdown of women holding Zoom meetings in their cars, packed outside their houses while their kids are pounding on the window, demanding help with their schoolwork. These are just some scenes meant to illustrate what I think is a crisis of care. If that's not a crisis of care, I don't know what is. Okay. No wonder then that struggles over social reproduction have exploded in recent years. Northern feminists have often described their focus as trying to readjust a better balance between family and work. But struggles over social reproduction encompass a lot more. Equally central are grassroots community movements seeking to defend and expand entitlements to housing, healthcare, job training, and income support. Movements for the rights of migrants, domestic workers, public employees, struggles for job security, decent wages, good working conditions, labor rights, union recognition, and the dignity of those who perform social service work in for-profit nursing homes, hospitals, and childcare centers. Struggles for public services, such as daycare, paid maternity and parental leave, such things that could enable everyone to combine reproductive activities with waged work. By and large, I think these struggles are not prohibitionist. And what I mean is they do not aim simply to abolish the commodification of care work or to resurrect romantic idealizations of maternal care. But neither do they want to subject social reproductive practices to the cutthroat logic of competitive markets. At their best, rather, they are seeking a deep restructuring of the whole production-reproduction division as it's institutionalized and financialized capitalism. What might these struggles accomplish? Well, I've been suggesting that the roots of our crisis of care lie in capitalism's social reproductive contradiction, or rather in the form that contradiction assumes in the present regime of financialized neoliberal capitalism. If that's right, then this crisis will not be resolved by tinkering at the edges with social policy. The path to its resolution can only go through deep structural transformation of the social order. And what is required above all is to overcome financialized capitalism's rapacious subjugation of reproduction to production. That requires a new way of imagining and institutionalizing the whole distinction between production and reproduction. But even that is not enough. As I said, the social reproductive strand of our present crisis is deeply entwined with the other strands, the ecological, political, and economic strands, and cannot be resolved in isolation from them. What is needed then is for social reproductive struggles to join with ecological and democratic political struggles in a broad-based alliance or counter-hegemonic bloc that aims to address our general crisis in its entirety. It remains to be seen, of course, whether such a bloc will emerge, and if so, whether it will succeed in shaping a major transformation of society. And if so, whether the outcome will preserve or in some way transform or even explode the basic structural framework of capitalist society. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your rich insights and all of your ideas. And I urge everybody to go and read your new book, because there's even more of all these thoughts in this book.